in the misty shadows of St. Mary's College. A locked laboratory hides a deadly secret. Professor Henry Caldwell, a brilliant chemist, found dead, poisoned by a silent gas. Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster, unravels a web of envy, ambition, and betrayal. A grieving widow with hidden desires, an ambitious student with a forged logbook, a resentful cleaner with a key, and a jealous colleague with a vendetta who wove the lethal trap. In a dance of clues, through ventilation ducts and locked doors, Miss Marple reveals the heart of a killer, proving no secret stays buried when truth is her needle. Chapter 1. The Silent Laboratory. The autumn mist clung to the cobbled streets of St. Mary's Mead, a quiet university town where the ancient spires of the college pierced the gray morning sky. In the cozy parlor of the Red Lion guest house, Miss Jane Marple, a slight figure in a tweed skirt and lavender cardigan, sat by a crackling fire, her delicate hands folded over a cup of Earl Grey. She had come to visit her nephew, Raymond West, a lecturer at St. Mary's College, to deliver a modest talk on the history of local lace-making. But the morning's news, delivered by a flustered chambermaid, had stirred her sharp mind to a different purpose. Professor Caldwell? Dead in his laboratory? Ma'am, the maid had whispered, her eyes wide. They say it was gas, most like. The words hung in the air, as potent as the mist outside. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, deceptively mild, flickered with interest. She thanked the maid with a gentle nod, her thoughts already threading through the possibilities. A laboratory, she reflected, was not unlike a village kitchen full of hidden dangers and guarded secrets. By noon, the town buzzed with speculation. Professor Henry Caldwell, a chemist of some renown, had been found slumped over his desk in the college's state-of-the-art laboratory, his face ashen, the air heavy with a faint, metallic temps. The room, a sterile fortress of glass beakers and steel cabinets, was locked from within, the only key discovered in the professor's waistcoat pocket. The police, under the command of Inspector Crane, a wiry man with a penchant for facts, but little patience for subtleties, had cordoned off the science wing. Murder, they declared, though the how and why remained elusive. Miss Marple, invited to the college by Raymond for a tour, found herself drawn to the tragedy. She declined a second cup of tea and made her way to the campus, her black leather handbag tucked under her arm. The college, with its ivy-clad halls and echoing quadrangles, felt subdued, the usual chatter of students replaced by hushed whispers. Raymond, a tall man with an earnest face, met her at the porter's lodge, his brow creased with worry. "A dreadful business, Aunt Jane," he said, guiding her through the archway. Caldwell was brilliant, if a bit aloof. His work on synthetic gases was set to revolutionize industry. Who'd want him dead? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind conjuring the image of a village grocer whose perfect life hid a tangle of debts and grudges. "People, Raymond," she said softly, "are rarely killed for their brilliance alone." At the science wing, a small crowd of faculty and students lingered near the police tape, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. Inspector Crane, his notebook in hand, was questioning a porter who had discovered the body. Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively to one side, listened as the porter described the scene, the locked door, the eerie silence, the strange smell that made his head swim. "I thought it was a spill at first," the man said, "but the professor, he wasn't moving." Crane spotted Miss Marple and approached, his expression a blend of respect and mild exasperation. He knew her reputation from a prior case in St. Mary's Mead, where her quiet observations had unraveled a poisoning. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "visiting, I presume. This is no place for a lady's curiosity." "Oh, Inspector," she replied, her voice light but her eyes keen. "I'm merely an old woman with a fondness for puzzles. But do tell me, was the gas deliberate?" Crane hesitated, then nodded. "Seems so. A rare compound. Not something you'd stumble across. We're looking at 4 suspects: his wife, Evelyn Caldwell; his student, Thomas Reed; his colleague, Dr. Marcus Finch; and the lab cleaner, Mrs. Clara Dobbs. All had access, all had reasons. Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind filing away the names like cards in a village bridge game. Access, she murmured, is only the beginning. Motives, Inspector, are what knit a crime together. Raymond, eager to distract her, suggested tea at the faculty lounge, but Miss Marple demurred, her gaze lingering on the sealed laboratory door across the courtyard. Its frosted glass revealed nothing, yet she sensed it held the key to more than just the room. She thought of Mrs. Hartley, a St. Mary's widow, whose locked pantry had concealed a stolen will. A locked room, she said to Raymond, almost to herself, is only as secure as the hearts around it. As they walked back through the quadrangle, the mist began to lift, revealing the sharp outlines of the college towers. Miss Marple's steps were slow but purposeful, her mind already weaving the threads of the case. 4 suspects, each with a key to the laboratory, and she suspected 2 secrets far less sterile than the room itself. Chapter 2. The Grieving Widow. The late afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's College Chapel, casting a mosaic of ruby and sapphire across the stone floor. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a polished oak pew, adjusted her shawl and observed the small gathering of mourners who had come to pay their respects to Professor Henry Caldwell. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies, arranged in ostentatious bouquets near the altar, and the low hum of organ music lent a somber dignity to the scene. Miss Marple, however, was less interested in the hymns than in the people, for she knew that grief, like a village fete, often revealed more than it concealed. Her nephew, Raymond West, had insisted she attend the memorial, partly to keep her from meddling in what he called police business. But Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, saw the chapel as a stage where motives might slip through the cracks of decorum. She had already learned, through discreet inquiries at the Red Lion guest house, that the professor's death was the talk of St. Mary's Mead. The locked laboratory, the mysterious gas, the 4 suspects, each detail was dissected over teacups and in the college quadrangle. Yet it was the widow, Mrs. Evelyn Caldwell, who drew Miss Marple's particular attention today. Evelyn stood near the altar, a striking figure in black silk, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon. She was 40, perhaps a touch older, with the kind of beauty that time had sharpened rather than softened. Her posture was erect, her movements deliberate, as she accepted condolences from a line of faculty and townsfolk. In her hand was a lace handkerchief, which she pressed to her eyes at intervals, though Miss Marple, from her vantage point, noted that the fabric remained pristine. A performance, she thought, recalling Mrs. Latham, a St. Mary's villager whose crocodile tears had masked a profitable insurance scheme. Miss Marple rose as the organist paused, her small frame moving with a deceptive frailty toward the widow. Raymond, hovering nearby, whispered Aunt Jane, "Don't pester her. She's distraught." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "My dear Raymond," she said, "a kind word is never a pester. Besides, I wish only to offer my sympathies." She approached Evelyn, who was speaking to a dour-looking dean in a tweed suit. The dean murmured something about Henry's legacy and shuffled off, leaving Evelyn momentarily alone. Miss Marple seized the opportunity, her voice soft but clear. "Mrs. Caldwell, I am Jane Marple, a visitor to the college. I was so sorry to hear of your loss. Your husband must have been a remarkable man." Evelyn turned, her green eyes assessing Miss Marple with a flicker of surprise, as if unused to such directness from a stranger. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and cultured, with a tremor that seemed practiced. "Henry was devoted to his work. It was his life." She dabbed the handkerchief to her cheek, and Miss Marple noted the absence of redness. in her eyes. Science is such a demanding mistress, Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. It must have been lonely at times, with him so absorbed. She tilted her head, as if inviting confidences, a technique honed over decades of village gossip. Evelyn's lips tightened briefly, then relaxed into a wistful smile. Oh, it was Henry spent more nights in that laboratory than at home. I used to joke he'd married his test tubes. She paused, then added, we had our moments, of course. Every marriage does. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away, the hint of strain in Evelyn's voice. I understand he was working on something extraordinary gases, wasn't it? Quite beyond an old woman like me, I'm afraid. Evelyn's smile faltered, and for a moment, her composure seemed to waver. Yes, synthetic gases. He believed they could change the world. But it was costly, Miss Marple. The equipment, the grants. It drained us. She caught herself, as if regretting the admission, and added quickly, but I supported him. I loved him. Of course, Miss Marple said gently, her eyes never leaving Evelyn's face. Love endures all trials. Did you visit him often? At the laboratory, to share in his triumphs. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. Not often, but the night before. Before it happened, I took him his briefcase. He'd forgotten it at home, and I knew he'd need it. I didn't stay long. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple detected a note of defensiveness, like that of a village shopkeeper caught overcharging. How thoughtful, Miss Marple said. It must comfort you, knowing you saw him so recently. She paused, then added, as if in passing, the laboratory is such a fortress, isn't it? All those locks and keys. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. Yes, Henry was particular about security. He didn't trust easily. She glanced toward the chapel door, where a group of faculty was gathering. If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I must speak to the provost. Miss Marple inclined her head graciously, stepping back as Evelyn moved away, her black silk skirt rustling. A fortress, Miss Marple murmured to herself, but even fortresses have gates. She thought of Mrs. Bingley, a St. Mary's widow whose locked jewelry box had been opened with a HAIRPIN. As the memorial service concluded, Miss Marple slipped out of the chapel and into the crisp autumn air. Raymond caught up with her, his expression a mix of amusement and concern. Aunt Jane, you were practically interrogating her. What did you learn? Only what she chose to tell, Miss Marple replied, her eyes scanning the quadrangle, where students hurried to evening lectures. But people, Raymond, always say more than they mean to. Mrs. Caldwell is grieving, perhaps, but not quite as she appears. They walked toward the faculty lounge, where Inspector Crane had agreed to meet them for a brief update. The lounge was a wood-paneled room, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced scholars. Crane was already there, nursing a cup of tea, his notebook open on the table. He rose as Miss Marple entered, his respect for her tempered by a wariness born of experience. Miss Marple, he said, I trust you're keeping out of trouble. Raymond says you've been poking about the chapel. Oh, Inspector, she replied, settling into a chair. I merely offered my condolences, but, since you're here, do tell me about Mrs. Caldwell. She mentioned visiting the laboratory the night before the murder. Crane's eyebrows lifted, and he flipped through his notebook. Did she, now? Yes, we confirmed that with the porter. She arrived around 7 p.m., said she was dropping off a briefcase. The porter saw her enter the science wing but didn't see her leave. Could have slipped out another way. Mind you, the college has more doors than a rabbit warren. Miss Marple's needles, which she had produced from her handbag, began to click softly. And the briefcase, she asked. Found in the lab. Near the professor's desk, Crane said. Nothing unusual in it. Papers, a fountain pen, some notes, but it places her at the scene, or close to it. We're still pinning down the timeline. The coroner says Caldwell died between 10 p.m. and midnight, so Evelyn's visit was a few hours earlier. Plenty of time, Miss Marple mused, for things to happen or to be arranged. She thought of a village seamstress who had visited a neighbor's house hours before a theft, claiming innocence. Crane leaned forward, lowering his voice. There's more. We've learned Evelyn and Caldwell weren't exactly the picture of marital bliss. Faculty gossip says they argued often, mostly about money. His research was a black hole, expensive equipment, endless experiments. She wanted him to take a consultancy, something practical, but he refused, said it would compromise his work. Miss Marple's needles paused. Money, she said, is a powerful motive, Inspector. It can unravel even the tightest bonds. She recalled Mr. Hodges, a St. Mary's farmer whose obsession with the new tractor had driven his wife to desperation. There's something else, Crane added, glancing at Raymond as if unsure whether to continue. A colleague mentioned seeing Evelyn at a college dinner last month, chatting rather warmly with Dean Whitmore. Nothing overt, but it raised eyebrows. If she was unhappy with Caldwell, well, it's worth considering. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was racing. A woman's heart, she said, is a labyrinth, Inspector. But so is a man's ambition. Tell me, what do we know of the laboratory itself? The gas, the locks, such a curious puzzle. Crane sighed, clearly reluctant to indulge her, but unable to resist her quiet authority. The gas is the devil of it. A synthetic compound, highly toxic in concentrated doses. Caldwell was developing it for industrial use, but it's not something you'd find lying about. The lab's gas cylinders were all accounted for, but traces of the compound were in the air filters. As for the locks, the door was bolted from the inside, key in Caldwell's pocket. No sign of tampering. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. A locked room, she said, is only as secure as its keeper. And the gas could, it had been introduced from outside the room. Crane frowned, considering. The ventilation system's a possibility, but it's a maze of ducts. We're having a technician look at it. The lab's designed to be airtight though, to prevent leaks. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Precision, Miss Marple said, is the mark of a clever mind or a desperate one. She thought of a village chemist who had accidentally mixed a fatal dose of laudanum, claiming ignorance. Raymond, who had been listening with growing impatience, interjected. Aunt Jane, you're turning this into one of your village mysteries. This is a scientific crime, not a squabble over a stolen pie. Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. My dear Raymond, human nature is the same, whether in a laboratory or a cottage. Greed, envy, love, they leave their traces everywhere. She turned to Crane. What of the other suspects? The student, the colleague, the cleaner. Crane closed his notebook, his expression guarded. Thomas Reed, the student, was in the lab late, working on the gas project. Ambitious lad, maybe. Too much so. Dr. Marcus Finch, Caldwell's rival, was seen near the science wing that evening, though he claims he was in his office. And Mrs. Clara Dobbs, the cleaner, had a master key and a grudge her son's in jail, and Caldwell wouldn't help him. All had means, all had opportunity. It's the why that's tripping us up. Miss Marple nodded, her mind sorting the names like threads in a tapestry. Opportunity, she said, is the door, but motive is the key. Mrs. Caldwell, I think, has more to tell us, even if she doesn't know it herself. As they left the lounge, the college clock chimed 6, its deep toll echoing across the quadrangle. Miss Marple paused, her eyes lingering on the science wing, where the laboratory stood silent, behind its cordon of police tape. Evelyn Caldwell, she sensed, was a woman caught in a web of her own making, grief, guilt, or something darker. It was too soon to say. But the widow's words, her dry handkerchief, her fleeting defensiveness, were like the first stitches in a pattern Miss Marple knew well. She thought of Mrs. Carter, a St. Mary's villager whose devoted marriage had ended in a poisoned well, the wife's tears as false as her alibi. A wife, Miss Marple murmured to Raymond, knows more than she tells, but less than she thinks. Her nephew sighed, accustomed to her cryptic pronouncements, and offered his arm as they walked into the gathering dusk. The mist had returned, curling around the college spires like a shroud. Miss Marple tightened her shawl, her mind already turning to the next thread in the case. Evelyn Caldwell was but one piece of the puzzle, and the laboratory, with its locked door and deadly gas, held secrets yet to be unraveled. Chapter 3. The ambitious student. The morning sun pierced the mist over St. Mary's Mead, casting long shadows across the college quadrangle as students hurried to their lectures. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, made her way to the library, a grand Gothic structure with towering shelves and the faint must of old books. She had promised Raymond a quiet day of research for her lace-making talk, but her true purpose was to observe Thomas Reed, Professor Caldwell's postgraduate student and a suspect in the chemist's murder. Miss Marple knew that libraries, like village post offices, were places where secrets slipped out in careless whispers. The library was abuzz with subdued chatter, students poring over texts or scribbling notes. Miss Marple, settling into a leather chair near the science section, produced her knitting, a soft gray shawl, perfect for blending into the background. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, scanned the room until they landed on Thomas, a lanky young man with untidy brown hair and a restless energy. He sat at a table with two undergraduates, his voice carrying just enough to reach her ears. Caldwell's gas formula was revolutionary, Thomas was saying, leaning forward, his hands gesturing animatedly. I was the one running the experiments, you know? He'd have been lost without me. His tone was boastful, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his darting glance, as if he feared being overheard. She thought of young Tommy Pierce, a St. Mary's lad who bragged about his pranks until one landed him in jail. Miss Marple adjusted her knitting, her needles clicking softly, and pretended to study a volume on local history. Thomas's companions, awed by his proximity to the late professor, pressed for details. Was it dangerous, working with that gas? One asked, a girl with a notebook open before her. Dangerous. Thomas laughed, a touch too loudly. Only if you didn't know what you were doing. I calibrated every cylinder myself. The professor trusted me with the lot. His fingers drummed on the table, and Miss Marple noted a gleaming gold watch on his wrist, its band too ornate for a student's budget. A gift, she recalled him claiming to Inspector Crane, from my parents. She thought of a village tailor's son who wore a borrowed ring to impress a girl. The library clock ticked toward 11, and Thomas excused himself, gathering his books with a haste that suggested an appointment. Miss Marple, feigning a need to stretch her legs, followed at a discreet distance, her steps muffled by the thick carpet. He headed toward the science wing, where the police tape still guarded the laboratory. A constable stood at the entrance, but Thomas veered toward a side door, slipping into a lecture hall. Miss Marple, pausing as if to admire a portrait of a former provost, noted the door's proximity to the lab. Convenient, she murmured, for one who knows the building's ways. She returned to the library, her mind turning over Thomas's words and manner. His ambition was palpable, but was it the kind that killed? She recalled Inspector Crane's report. Thomas had been in the laboratory the night of the murder, calibrating equipment until 9:30. By his account, he claimed to have left Caldwell alive, but a search of his dorm had uncovered a notebook, with formulas matching the lethal gas. Clever, Miss Marple thought, but cleverness often stumbles on its own pride. At noon, Raymond joined her for tea in the faculty lounge, his expression a mix of fondness and exasperation. Aunt Jane, you're supposed to be researching lace, not chasing suspects. I saw you trailing that student like a bloodhound. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes twinkling. My dear Raymond, a library is a treasure trove of character. Young Mr. Reed is ambitious, but ambition is a flame that can burn its keeper. She set down her cup, her tone light but probing. What do you know of him? He seems well favored for a student. Raymond shrugged, buttering a scone. Thomas Reed, bright enough, from what I hear. Caldwell's protege, always at his elbow in the lab. Word is, he's angling for a big job with an industrial firm, one that's keen on Caldwell's gas research. But he's a bit full of himself, thinks he's the next Nobel laureate. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. A job offer, she said softly, is a powerful lure, and expensive watches are not bought on a student's stipend. She thought of a St. Mary's apprentice who had stolen to fund a grand dream. After tea, Miss Marple persuaded Raymond to accompany her to the science wing, claiming a wish to understand the laboratory's layout. Inspector Crane, whom they met near the cordoned-off lab, was deep in conversation with a technician examining the ventilation ducts. He greeted Miss Marple with a resigned nod, accustomed to her persistent curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, "I suppose you're here to solve my case for me. We're still combing the lab, nothing new, I'm afraid. The gas is the puzzle. No missing cylinders, yet it was there, clear as day in the filters." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the lab's frosted glass door, its lock gleaming under the fluorescent light. "And Mr. Reed," she said, as if the thought had just occurred to her, "he worked with the gas, did he not? A young man with such knowledge must be invaluable." Crane's expression sharpened. "He did. Reed's prints were all over the equipment, but that's to be expected. He was Caldwell's assistant. That notebook, though, is troubling. Formulas for the gas, step by step. He says it was part of his thesis, but it's too close to the murder weapon for my liking." Miss Marple tilted her head, her knitting needles pausing in her lap. "A thesis," she said, "is a fine thing, but knowledge can be a double-edged sword." Was he questioned about his movements? Crane flipped open his notebook. "Says he left the lab at 9:30, went to his dorm, and stayed in bed. No one saw him after he left the science wing, but no one saw him in the dorm either. His alibi is as thin as tissue paper." He glanced at the technician, who was packing up his tools. "We're checking the ducts now. If the gas came from outside, Reed would have known how to rig it. He had the run of the place." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the ventilation grate above the lab door, its metal slats barely visible in the shadow. "A young man with access," she said, "and ambition. But ambition, Inspector, is often a mask for something deeper." She thought of a village boy who had sabotaged a rival's boat. Not for gain, but for envy. But Raymond, growing restless, suggested they return to the guest house, but Miss Marple demurred, her eyes catching a figure emerging from the lecture hall. It was Thomas, his satchel slung over his shoulder, his face flushed as if from a heated exchange. He glanced toward the lab, then hurried across the quadrangle. Unaware of Miss Marple's watchful gaze, she turned to Crane, her voice soft but insistent. "Inspector, have you searched Mr. Reed's belongings beyond the notebook? A young man's possessions often tell a story." Crane's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "We did a cursory check, nothing but books and clothes." "Why? What are you thinking?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Only that a watch, Inspector, is a curious thing to wear when one claims to be poor. And ambition, like gas, can be volatile when mishandled." She thought of a St. Mary's clerk who had flaunted a gift that proved to be stolen as they left the science wing. The college clock chimed 1, its toll reverberating through the crisp air. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind weaving Thomas Reed's boasts, his watch, his unverified alibi into a pattern not yet complete. He was clever, yes, but was he cunning? The laboratory, with its locked door and silent menace, held the answer, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a knot beginning to loosen. Raymond, sensing her distraction, sighed. "Aunt Jane, you're incorrigible." What's Reed done to earn your suspicion? Miss Marple patted his arm, her eyes distant but bright. Nothing, Raymond, that he hasn't told us himself. But people, you see, always leave crumbs of truth in their pride. She thought of a village girl whose boasts about a new dress had led to a thief's capture, and her steps quickened as they headed toward the guest house, the case unfolding like a skein of wool in her nimble hands. Chapter 4. The Jealous Colleague. The afternoon sky over St. Mary's Mead was a patchwork of gray clouds, the air sharp with the promise of rain as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the college's faculty common room. Her nephew, Raymond West, had arranged for her to attend a tea hosted by the science department. A gathering meant to honor Professor Caldwell's memory, but likely, Miss Marple suspected, to air grievances and gossip. She carried her knitting bag, its contents a comforting pretext for her true purpose, to study Dr. Marcus Finch, Caldwell's colleague, and a man whose name had surfaced in whispers as a rival with a grudge. Miss Marple knew that tea, like a village sewing circle, loosened tongues and revealed truths. The common room was a stately space, its high ceilings adorned with plasterwork, and its walls hung with portraits of dour academics. A long table bore silver urns of tea, plates of scones, and a murmur of conversation that hushed briefly as Miss Marple entered. She wore a simple tweed dress, her silver hair neatly pinned, and her mild demeanor invited little notice precisely as she intended. Raymond, at her elbow, muttered, "Aunt Jane, behave yourself. These are scholars, not your village rogues." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "My dear Raymond," she said, "scholars are merely people with longer words for their sins." She accepted a cup of tea from a hovering porter and settled into a chair near the fireplace, where she could observe the room without seeming to stare. Dr. Marcus Finch stood by a window, a lean man in his late 40s with thinning hair and a perpetually pinched expression. He wore a gray suit, its cuffs slightly frayed, and held a teacup with the grip of someone restraining stronger impulses. He was speaking to a young lecturer, his voice low but edged with bitterness. Caldwell's work was overrated, Miss Marple overheard, her knitting needles clicking softly. All flash, no substance. The grants should have gone to those of us doing real science. The lecturer nodded, eager to please, but Finch's eyes, dark and restless, betrayed a deeper resentment. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the fragments she had gathered. Inspector Crane had mentioned Finch's presence near the laboratory the evening of the murder, ostensibly to discuss a joint paper with Caldwell. Yet Finch claimed to have left by 8, a statement unconfirmed by witnesses. His office, Crane had noted, was adjacent to the lab, connected by a shared ventilation system, a detail Miss Marple found as intriguing as a loose thread in a village quilt. She recalled a St. Mary's gardener, Mr. Gibbs, whose envy of a neighbor's roses led to a midnight sabotage. His spade hidden in plain sight, she rose, feigning a need to admire a portrait, and maneuvered closer to Finch, who had turned to refill his cup. "Dr. Finch, I presume," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "I'm Jane Marple, a guest of the college. I understand you worked closely with poor Professor Caldwell. Such a loss." Finch's head snapped up, his thin lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone clipped. "Yes, a loss, I suppose. Henry and I collaborated, though closely is generous. He preferred the spotlight." He stirred his tea with unnecessary vigor, the spoon clinking against the china. "Oh, I'm sure," Miss Marple said, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "But to share such important work gases, wasn't it? Must have been rewarding. I'm only an old woman, but I imagine it's like tending a garden together, each with a role." Finch's smile tightened. "A garden where one man hogs the sun," he muttered, then caught himself. That is, Henry was proprietary. His gas research was promising, but he exaggerated its scope. I warned him it needed more testing. His fingers twitched, and Miss Marple noted a faint tremor, like that of a village shopkeeper caught fudging his ledger. How wise, she said. And you saw him that evening, I believe. To discuss your paper, it must be a comfort, having spoken to him so recently. Finch's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, briefly. I stopped by his lab around 7:30. We disagreed rather about the paper's direction. I left soon after. My office is next door, you see. I had work to finish. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple detected a rehearsed quality, like a village boy reciting an alibi. Of course, she said, her needles pausing. An office so near the laboratory must be convenient. Almost like living in the same house, with all its comings and goings. She smiled, her gaze soft but probing, and Finch excused himself. Abruptly, claiming a need to speak to the dean, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind weaving Finch's words into the pattern of the case. His bitterness was palpable, his alibi as flimsy as Thomas Reed's. Crane had mentioned a rejected grant, overshadowed by Caldwell's funding, and a rumor of a stolen idea, years ago, when Finch and Caldwell were young lecturers. Envy, she murmured, is a weed that chokes the heart. She thought of Mrs. Ellis, a St. Mary's seamstress, who had slashed a rival's gown over a lost commission. Raymond, who had been chatting with a historian, rejoined her, his brow creased. Aunt Jane, you're at it again? What did you say? To Finch. He looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Only pleasantries, she replied, her needles resuming their rhythm. But Dr. Finch, I think, carries a heavier burden than his teacup. She glanced toward the window, where Finch now stood alone, staring into the gathering dusk. Later, Miss Marple persuaded Raymond to accompany her to the science wing, claiming a wish to see the college's modern facilities. Inspector Crane was there, overseeing a technician who was photographing the lab's ventilation ducts. He greeted Miss Marple with a wry smile, his notebook tucked under his arm. Miss Marple, he said, I should have known you'd turn up. We're still puzzling over the gas. No source in the lab, but the filters tell a story, and Finch's office shares the ducts. If someone tampered with them, he'd have had the chance. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the grate above the lab door, its slats catching the light. And the knowledge, she said softly. Dr. Finch is a chemist, is he not? He would understand gases, their movement, their possibilities. Crane nodded, his expression thoughtful. He's a specialist in dispersal systems, how gases spread in confined spaces. Caldwell's project was the flashy one, but Finch's work is solid. He'd know how to handle the compound, no question. Problem is, we've got no proof he did. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind turning over the ventilation system's implications. A duct, she said, is like a village lane, quiet, unnoticed, but leading everywhere. She thought of a St. Mary's poacher who used hidden paths to steal game. His tracks invisible to all but the sharpest eyes. Crane flipped open his notebook. We did find something odd. A logbook entry, signed by Finch, shows a gas cylinder replaced in the lab a week ago. Routine, he says, but the timing's convenient. If he swapped in a tainted one, it'd be clever, too clever, maybe. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright. Cleverness, Inspector, is often its own undoing. A man like Dr. Finch, with a grudge nursed so long, might see a chance and take it. She recalled a village blacksmith whose envy of a rival's forge led to a mishap with a hammer. Raymond, growing impatient, suggested they return to the guest house, but Miss Marple lingered, her gaze fixed on Finch's office door, just visible down the corridor. Its proximity to the lab was no accident, she sensed, any more than Finch's bitterness was mere temperament. A colleague, she said to Raymond, almost to herself, is a friend until he's not. And envy, my dear, is a poison older than any gas. As they left the science wing, the first drops of rain pattered against the cobblestones, and the college clock chimed for Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter, her mind tracing the contours of Finch's resentment, his words, his tremor, his too quick departure. He was a man, she thought, who saw himself eclipsed, and such men were dangerous when cornered. The laboratory, with its silent ducts and locked door, held the key, and Miss Marple felt the pattern of the case tightening, stitched by careful stitch. Chapter 5. The unseen cleaner. The rain that had threatened St. Mary's Mead all afternoon arrived in earnest by evening, drumming against the leaded windows of the college kitchens, where Miss Jane Marple found herself, ostensibly to compliment the cook on a fine batch of scones served at the faculty tea. In truth, her purpose was to speak with Mrs. Clara Dobbs, the laboratory cleaner, and the last of the 4 suspects in Professor Henry Caldwell's murder. Miss Marple knew that kitchens, like village parlors, were where the unnoticed shared their truths, and Clara, with her master key and quiet presence, intrigued her as much as any scholar's ambition. The kitchen was a warm, bustling space, its air thick with the scent of baking bread and simmering soup. Cooks and maids moved with practiced efficiency, their chatter a low hum beneath the clatter of pots. Miss Marple, her gray shawl draped over her shoulders, stood near a flour-dusted table, her knitting bag at her side. She had slipped in through a side door, guided by a porter, who assumed her an eccentric guest of the college. Her eyes, keen despite her mild demeanor, sought Clara, who was scrubbing a stack of trays at a sink in the corner. Clara Dobbs was a wiry woman in her 60s, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun, her hands red and rough from years of labor. She worked with a dogged focus, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if the trays were a personal affront. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft on the stone floor, and cleared her throat gently. "Mrs. Dobbs, I believe. I'm Jane Marple, a visitor to the college. I wanted to thank you for keeping the science wing so spotless. It must be quite a task." Clara glanced up, her brown eyes sharp with suspicion, then returned to her scrubbing. "It's my job," she said, her voice gruff but not unkind. "Labs are messy, professors messier. Don't need thanks for it." Her hands moved faster, the brush scraping rhythmically, and Miss Marple noted the tension in her shoulders, like that of a village washerwoman hiding a family scandal. "But it's such important work," Miss Marple said, her tone warm and encouraging. "A laboratory, with all its delicate instruments, must rely on someone trustworthy. You were there, I understand, the night before poor Professor Caldwell's accident." She let the word hang, her eyes soft but watchful. Clara's brush paused, just for a moment, before resuming its furious pace. "I clean every night," she said. "Nothing special about that one. Mopped the floors, wiped the benches, left. By 10. Didn't see nothing odd." Her gaze flicked to Miss Marple, then away, and Miss Marple caught a glint of unease, like that of a St. Mary's maid who knew more about a theft than she admitted. "How diligent," Miss Marple said, producing her knitting from her bag and settling onto a nearby stool, as if settling in for a chat. "It must be strange, working so late, with the college so quiet. Did you see the professor that evening? Or perhaps his student, or Dr. Finch?" Clara's lips tightened, and she dunked a tray into the soapy water with a splash. "Saw the professor, working at his desk, like always. Didn't talk to him, never did. He wasn't one for chit-chat. Didn't see the others. I mind my own business." Her words were clipped, her eyes fixed on the sink, and Miss Marple sensed a wall, carefully built, but not impenetrable, of course. Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly, "But a cleaner sees everything, doesn't she? The little things others miss, papers left out, doors left ajar. It's like tending a house, knowing its every creak." She smiled, her voice inviting confidences. "A skill honed in countless village kitchens." Clara snorted, but her hand slowed. "Folks don't notice cleaners," she said, almost to herself. We're invisible till something's missing or broken. Then it's our fault. There was a bitterness in her tone, and Miss Marple seized on it, like a gardener spotting a weed. It must be trying, she said, to work so hard and be overlooked. I heard. Forgive me, it's only gossip. That you had some trouble with the professor. Something about your son. She kept her tone gentle, her eyes on her knitting, as if the question were mere curiosity. Clara's brush stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was the rain against the windows. When she spoke, her voice was low, laced with a raw edge. My boy Jimmy got mixed up in some nonsense stealing tools from a garage. He's no angel, but he's not bad. Caldwell could have spoken for him, said he was a hard worker when he helped in the lab last summer. But he wouldn't. Said it wasn't his place. Jimmy's in jail now, 6 months. She resumed scrubbing, but her movements were mechanical, her eyes distant. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind filing away the resentment in Clara's voice. How unfair, she said softly. A mother's heart feels such things deeply. It must have been hard, seeing the professor every day, knowing he could have helped. Clara shrugged, but her jaw tightened. I did my job. Didn't matter what I thought of him. Still don't. She turned to stack the trays, her back to Miss Marple, signaling the conversation's end. But Miss Marple had seen enough. Flicker of anger, the guarded silence, the weight of a grudge carried like a stone. She thought of Mrs. Tate, a St. Mary's laundress, whose quiet rage at a neighbor's betrayal had led to a slashed curtain. Rising, Miss Marple tucked her knitting away and thanked Clara, who nodded curtly without turning. As she left the kitchen, the rain had softened to a drizzle, and she found Raymond waiting in the quadrangle, his umbrella at the ready. Aunt Jane, he said, exasperation in his voice. You were in there ages. What could you possibly want with the cleaner? Only a chat, Miss Marple replied, her eyes bright, despite the gray evening. But people, Raymond, reveal themselves in their silences as much as their words. Mrs. Dobbs is a woman with a wound, and wounds left untended can fester. She thought of a village baker whose grudge against a rival had simmered until a fire broke out. They walked toward the Red Lion guest house, where Inspector Crane had promised to meet them with an update. The guest house parlor was cozy, its fire crackling as Crane arrived, shaking rain from his coat. He settled into an armchair, his notebook open, and fixed Miss Marple with a look of resigned amusement. Miss Marple, I hear you've been in the kitchens. Don't tell me you're suspecting the soup now. She smiled, her needles clicking as she resumed her shawl. Only the ingredients of human nature, Inspector. Mrs. Dobbs, I understand, had access to the laboratory. A master key, I believe. Crane nodded, flipping a page. She did. Cleaners have keys to every room in the science wing. She was in the lab that night, same as every night, cleaning from 9 to 10. Says she saw Caldwell at his desk, didn't speak to him, and left. No one saw her after she locked up, but the porter confirms she turned in her key by 10:15. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. We found a gas mask in the cleaning closet though, standard issue for the lab, but it's odd she never mentioned using it. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. A gas mask, she said, is a curious thing to overlook. And her son did, you know. The professor refused to help him. Crane's eyebrows rose. We did. Jimmy Dobbs, small-time thief. Caldwell could have vouched for his character, but he didn't. Clara's not been the same since, according to the kitchen staff. Keeps to herself, works like a machine, but murder, that's a leap. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice soft but probing. Resentment, Inspector, is a seed that grows in the dark. Mrs. Dobbs had access, perhaps opportunity, but the gas, would she have known how to use it? Crane rubbed his chin, considering, doubtful. The gas was complex, needed precise mixing. Caldwell, Reed, and Finch knew the formula. Clara's a cleaner, not a chemist. Still, she had the run of the lab, and that key. He trailed off, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's. You think she's hiding something? Only what most people hide, Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their rhythm. The truth of their feelings. A woman like Mrs. Dobbs, invisible to the world, sees more than she's credited for. She thought of a St. Mary's charwoman, who had overheard a plot while polishing a banister. Her silence bought with a shilling. Raymond, who had been listening with growing impatience, interjected. Aunt Jane, you're making a mountain out of a mop. Clara's just a cleaner, not a mastermind. Miss Marple patted his hand, her smile serene. My dear Raymond, the unseen are often the most observant. Mrs. Dobbs may not have mixed the gas, but she walked through that laboratory every night. What she saw, or chose not to see, is a thread worth following. She thought of a village milkman whose routine deliveries had masked a smuggling ring. Crane closed his notebook, rising to leave. I'll have another word with her, he said, and we're still checking the ventilation ducts. If the gas came from outside, Clara might have noticed something, a loose grate, a strange smell. She's not off the hook. As he departed, the guest house clock struck 8, its chimes mingling with the patter of rain. Miss Marple gazed into the fire, her mind tracing Clara's guarded words, her unspoken anger, her invisible presence, in the laboratory's sterile world. A cleaner, she knew, was never truly unseen, not to the dust, nor to the secrets it covered. The case, like her knitting, was taking shape, each stitch a step closer to the truth. Chapter 6. The locked room. The morning following the rain brought a crisp clarity to St. Mary's Mead, the college spires gleaming under a washed blue sky. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a breakfast of toast and marmalade at the Red Lion guest house, set out for the science wing, her black handbag swinging lightly at her side. She had persuaded Inspector Crane to allow her a brief tour of Professor Caldwell's laboratory, claiming a laywoman's curiosity about modern science. In truth, she sought to understand the locked room itself, for she knew that places, like people, held secrets in their silences. Raymond, her nephew, had declined to join her, muttering about lectures and her meddling, leaving her to navigate the college alone. The science wing was a stark contrast to the college's ancient halls, its corridors lined with white tiles and buzzing fluorescent lights. The laboratory, still sealed with police tape, stood at the end of a quiet hallway, its frosted glass door a mute sentinel. Inspector Crane met her there, his face etched with the fatigue of a case that refused to yield. Miss Marple, he said, unlocking the door. 10 minutes, no more, and don't touch anything. This is a crime scene, not a museum. Oh, Inspector, she replied, her voice mild. I'm only an old woman with a fondness for puzzles. I shan't disturb a thing. Her eyes, however, were anything but idle, scanning the door's heavy bolt and the keyhole, polished to a gleam. She thought of a locked shed in St. Mary's Mead, where a secure latch had hidden a poacher's snare. The laboratory was a cavern of order, its benches lined with glassware that sparkled under the overhead lights. Steel cabinets housed equipment Miss Marple could scarcely name, spectrometers, she supposed, and things with dials and tubes. A faint metallic temps lingered in the air, a ghost of the gas that had killed Caldwell. The professor's desk, tucked in a corner, bore a neat stack of papers, a fountain pen, and the briefcase Evelyn had delivered. The windows, sealed and reinforced, admitted no draft, and the ventilation grates, high on the walls, were the only breach in the room's fortress-like design. Crane gestured to the desk, found him there, slumped over his notes. No struggle, no marks. The gas did its work quick. He pointed to the door. Locked from the inside, key in his pocket. No sense, unless someone tampered with the lock or got in another way. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the ventilation grate above the desk, its slats caked with a fine dust. The ducts, she said, almost to herself. They connect to Dr. Finch's office. I believe, and perhaps elsewhere. Crane nodded, his notebook already open. They do. We've got a technician mapping the system. Its a warren runs through the whole wing. If the gas came through there, it explained the locked door. But it'd take precision and knowledge of the lab setup. He paused, eyeing her. You've got a theory, haven't you? Miss Marple smiled, her fingers brushing the edge of her handbag. Only that a locked room, Inspector, is only as secure as its keeper. A laboratory is like a village attic sealed, but never truly secret. She thought of a St. Mary's spinster, whose locked attic hid a trap door, revealed by a creaking board. She moved to the desk, careful not to touch, and studied the logbook Crane had mentioned. Its pages, meticulously kept, recorded equipment checks and cylinder replacements. One entry, dated a week before the murder, caught her eye. A gas cylinder swapped out, signed by Dr. Marcus Finch. Routine, Finch had called it, but Miss Marple's mind snagged on the timing. Like a village grocer's ledger showing an odd delivery before a theft. The gas, she said, turning to Crane. You said it was rare, complex. Could it have been stored in a cylinder, released later? Crane rubbed his chin, his eyes narrowing. Possible. The cylinders are pressurized, tightly sealed. If someone swapped one with a doctored mix, it could have been triggered remotely, say, by loosening a valve. But we checked the cylinders here. All clean, no traces of the compound. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the ventilation grate, and the ducts. Could they carry such a gas, unnoticed? We're testing that, Crane said. The filters caught traces, which means the gas was in the air, not just the room. Problem is, the ducts are shared. Finch's office, the lecture halls, even the cleaning closet. Anyone with access could have tampered with them, but they'd need to know the gas's properties. He flipped a page in his notebook. Caldwell, Red, and Finch had that knowledge. Mrs. Dobbs, maybe not, but she had the keys. Evelyn. Well, she studied chemistry years ago, though she claims to have forgotten it. Miss Marple's needles, which she had produced to occupy her hands, clicked softly. A shared system, she said, is like a village well open to all, but poisoned by one. She thought of a St. Mary's well, tainted by a farmer's spite. Its source traced to a hidden pipe. She circled the room, her steps slow but purposeful, noting the sealed windows, the single door, the absence of clutter. The laboratory was a puzzle, its pieces too perfect, like a village crime staged to baffle. The coroner, she said, pausing by a bench, placed the death between 10 and midnight. Each suspect was near the lab that evening. Yes. Crane nodded, ticking off names. Evelyn, dropping off the briefcase around 7. Finch, in and out by 8, he says. Reed, calibrating equipment till 9:30. Dobbs, cleaning from 9 to 10. All within a few hours, but no one saw the others, or so they claim. Alibis are shaky, but the locked door's the real devil. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her voice remained soft. A devil, perhaps, but not invincible. A room is only locked if we believe it so, and the gassed silence is its strength, but also its weakness. She thought of a St. Mary's burglary, where a sealed window hid a clever latch, undone. With a hairpin, Crane, sensing her drift, led her to the ventilation grate, where a technician had left a ladder. We're pulling samples from here, he said. If the gas came through, there'll be residue in the ducts, maybe even a device, a valve, a canister. But it's slow work, and the college wants us out before classes resume. Miss Marple peered at the grate. Its slats too narrow for a hand but wide enough for Aaron, she suspected, for malice. Slow work, she said, is often the surest. A laboratory inspector is a place of precision, but human hearts are anything but. She stepped back, her mind weaving the room's sterile order with the chaos of Modovavelin's strained marriage, Reed's ambition, Finch's envy, Dobbs's grudge, As they left the lab, Crane relocked the door, its bolt sliding home with a heavy thud. The corridor was empty, save for a porter sweeping the floor, his broom whispering against the tiles. Miss Marple paused, her gaze lingering on the lab's door, its frosted glass opaque as the truth it guarded. A locked room, she said to Crane, almost to herself, is a challenge, not a barrier. Someone found a way, and that way will betray them. Crane, tucking his notebook away, gave her a wry look. You're wasted on lace-making, Miss Marple. If you figure out that way, let me know before I lose what's left of my hair. She smiled, her handbag swinging as they walked toward the quadrangle. Patience, Inspector. Truth, like a good stitch, takes time to set. She thought of a St. Mary's widow, whose impossible theft was solved by a child's marble, rolled under a locked door. The college clock struck 11, its chimes echoing across the sunlit cobblestones. Miss Marple felt the case tightening, the laboratory's silent clues, its ducks, its logbook, its sealed perfection, pointing to a mind as calculated as the room itself. She thought of a village mystery, where a perfect crime unraveled over a misplaced needle, and her steps quickened, the next thread waiting to be pulled. Chapter 7. Shadows of Motive. The early evening light softened the edges of St. Mary's College, casting a golden glow over the quadrangle as Miss Jane Marple arrived at the faculty dining hall for a formal dinner. The event, organized to honor the college's benefactors, was a grand affair. With long tables draped in white linen and silver candelabra flickering against the oak-paneled walls, Miss Marple, invited as Raymond's guest, wore a modest black dress, her silver hair neatly pinned, and carried her knitting bag as a shield against the pomp. She knew that dinners, like village suppers, were fertile ground for unguarded words, and tonight she hoped to glean the motives that danced in the shadows of Professor Caldwell's murder. The hall buzzed with the low murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the rustle of academic gowns. Miss Marple, seated between Raymond and a talkative historian, let her eyes roam the room, noting the suspects among the guests. Evelyn Caldwell, elegant in widow's black, sat near the provost, her smile practiced but strained. Thomas Reed, in a borrowed suit, hovered at a table of students, his voice loud with self-assurance. Dr. Marcus Finch, dour as ever, picked at his meal in silence, his eyes fixed on his plate. Clara Dobbs, though not a guest, moved among the servers, her wiry frame nearly invisible as she refilled teapots. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her lap, remained still, but her mind was as busy as a village gossip's tongue. The historian, a jovial man with a penchant for anecdotes, leaned toward her. Dreadful business, this Caldwell affair, he said, slicing his roast beef. The college hasn't seen such a scandal since the bursar ran off with the endowment in '98. They say it was gas. Locked room and all. Quite the mystery, eh, Miss Marple? Oh, quite, she replied, her tone mild, but her ears sharp. Murder is always a puzzle, but people, you see, are its pieces. They fit together, if one looks closely. She thought of a St. Mary's jigsaw, where a missing piece found under a vicar's rug had solved a theft. Her gaze settled on Evelyn, who was laughing softly at something Dean Whitmore said, her hand brushing his arm. The gesture was fleeting, but Miss Marple noted the provost's frown and the whispers among nearby faculty. Mrs. Caldwell, she said to the historian, as if in passing, seems to bear her grief with grace. She and the dean are old friends, I suppose. The historian chuckled, lowering his voice. Friends, yes, and perhaps more, if gossip's to be believed. Evelyn's been seen with Whitmore at college events, always a touch too cozy. Caldwell was blind to it, buried in his lab. Not that I blame her. Henry was a cold fish. He took a sip of wine, oblivious to Miss Marple's keen interest. She thought of Mrs. Vernon, a St. Mary's widow whose friendship with a butcher had masked a deeper discontent. Across the room, Thomas Reed's voice rose above the din, regaling his table with tales of the gas research. The formula was mine, practically, he boasted, his gold watch glinting as he gestured. Caldwell just signed the papers. His companions laughed, but Miss Marple caught a nervous edge in his tone, like a village lad bragging about a prank that went too far. She leaned toward Raymond, who was picking at his peas. "Young Mr. Reed," she said softly, "seems very sure of his place. Has he always been so confident?" Raymond sighed, accustomed to her probing. "Thomas, he's a peacock, always. Was. Word is, he's got a job offer from some chemical firm, contingent on the gas project's success. He's been strutting about since Caldwell's death, as if he's inherited the lab." He shook his head. "Tasteless, if you ask me." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind filing away the job offer's weight. "A prize like that," she said, "can make a young man reckless." She thought of a St. Mary's apprentice, whose ambition for a tailor's shop led to a forged deed. Her attention shifted to Finch, who had pushed his plate away and was sipping water, his face a mask of restraint. A junior lecturer, trying to draw him out, mentioned Caldwell's research, and Finch's reply was curt. "Henry's work was a house of cards. It'll collapse without him." His voice carried a venom that silenced the table, and he excused himself, claiming a headache. Miss Marple watched him leave, his steps stiff, and noted the glances exchanged among the faculty. "Dr. Finch," she murmured, "carries his grudge like a badge." She thought of Mr. Hale, a St. Mary's carpenter, who had sabotaged a rival's workbench over a lost contract. Clara Dobbs, meanwhile, moved through the hall with the efficiency of a shadow, her tray of teapots steady despite the crowd. As she passed Miss Marple's table, a professor mentioned Caldwell's name, and Clara's hand faltered, a cup clattering onto its saucer. She recovered quickly, her face blank, but Miss Marple's needles twitched in her lap. A small thing, she thought, but small things betray the heart. She recalled a St. Mary's maid who dropped a tray when her master's infidelity was mentioned, her silence louder than words. The dinner progressed to dessert, a rich trifle that Miss Marple declined, preferring to watch the room. The faculty's chatter grew looser with wine, and snippets of gossip reached her ears. Evelyn's flirtations, Thomas's job offer, Finch's rejected grant, Clara's jailed son. Each suspect, she sensed, was a thread in a tapestry of motive, ambition, envy, resentment woven around the laboratory's locked door. She thought of a village fete, where a quarrel over a cake contest had unraveled a web of grudges. As the guests rose for coffee in the anteroom, Miss Marple slipped away to the corridor, claiming a need for air. She found Inspector Crane near the science wing, his coat damp from a brief patrol in the drizzle. He was studying a diagram of the ventilation ducts, his brow furrowed. "Miss Marple," he said, pocketing the paper, out sleuthing again. "I thought you'd be at the dinner, not haunting my crime scene." "Only stretching my legs, Inspector," she replied, her smile disarming. "But since you're here, what news of the ducts? They seem to hold the secret of our locked room." Her eyes, bright despite the dim light, fixed on his face. Crane sighed, leaning against the wall. "We're getting somewhere. The technician found residue in the ducts, matching the gas. It's faint, but it suggests the gas came from outside the lab, maybe Finch's office, maybe elsewhere. Problem is, we need a device, a valve, a canister to prove it wasn't an accident. And motive, none of the suspects is screaming killer. Yet, Miss Marple's needles, produced from her bag, began to click. Motive, she said, is a shadow, Inspector. It moves with the light. Tonight, I saw Evelyn with the dean, Thomas with his boasts, Finch with his bile, Clara with her flinch. Each has a reason, but only one had the means and the moment." She paused, her voice soft but probing. "The gas, you said, required precise mixing. Who among them could manage it? Crane flipped open his notebook, his voice low. Caldwell, Reed, and Finch. For sure they knew the formula. Evelyn took chemistry in her youth, but that's a stretch. Clara's the outlier, no training, but she had access. A gas mask in the cleaning closet doesn't help her case, though she swears she never used it. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion creeping in. It's like chasing smoke. Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles steady. Smoke, she said. Leaves traces. Inspector, a laboratory is a place of precision, but people are not. Someone misstepped, and the dinner tonight showed their cracks. She thought of a St. Mary's vicar, whose sermon on forgiveness had faltered when a rival's name was mentioned, his pause betraying a feud. Crane straightened, tucking his notebook away. I'll re-interview them tomorrow. Press harder on the alibis. Evelyn's cozy with Whitmore. Reed's job offer smells like a bribe. Finch's grant rejection stinks of motive. And Clara's son, well, grudges run deep. You see anything tonight I should know? Miss Marple smiled, her eyes distant but sharp. Only what people show, Inspector. Motive is the heart, but opportunity is the hand. The laboratory's ducts, I think, will tell us more than any alibi. She thought of a village well, poisoned by a single vial. Its source traced by a child's keen eye. As they parted, the college clock struck 9, its chimes swallowed by the damp air. Miss Marple returned to the guest house, her mind weaving. The evening's observations, Eveline's flirtation, Thomas's bravado, Finch's venom, Clara's clatter into the pattern of the case. The locked room was no longer a fortress, but a stage, and its players, she sensed, were nearing their final act. She thought of a St. Mary's quilt, its stitches hiding a coded message, and settled by the fire, her needles dancing as the truth drew closer. Chapter 8. The ventilation cloth. The morning air in St. Mary's Mead carried a damp chill. The cobblestones slick from an overnight drizzle as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to the science wing of St. Mary's College. Her black handbag swung lightly at her side, and her lavender shawl was pinned neatly over her tweed dress. But her mind was far from the quaint routine of a village spinster. The laboratory, with its locked door and silent menace, had become the pivot of her thoughts, and today she aimed to unravel the mystery of the ventilation ducts, which she suspected held the key to Professor Henry Caldwell's murder. Inspector Crane had agreed to meet her there, swayed by her gentle persistence and the nagging sense that her insights were outpacing his own. The science wing was quieter than usual, the students' chatter muted by the weight of the ongoing investigation. The laboratory's frosted glass door remained sealed with police tape, a stark reminder of the crime within. Crane was already present, standing by a technician who was perched on a ladder, probing a ventilation grate with a gloved hand. The inspector's face was drawn, his notebook tucked under his arm, and he greeted Miss Marple with a nod that mixed respect with exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, "you're like a hound on a scent. I hope you're not expecting a grand reveal today. The ducks are giving us more questions than answers." "Oh, Inspector," she replied, her voice soft but her eyes sharp. "Questions are the stepping stones to truth. I only wish to see the laboratory again, to understand its airways, shall we say." She adjusted her shawl, her gaze drifting to the grate, its slats glinting under the corridor's fluorescent lights. She thought of a St. Mary's chimney, where a hidden flue had concealed a smuggler's cache, discovered by a sweep's keen eye. Crane gestured to the technician, who descended the ladder, wiping his hands on a rag. "We've found residue in the ducts," the technician said, his voice clipped with professional detachment. "Matches the gas that killed Caldwell, same chemical signature. It's concentrated near the lab's intake, but traces run all the way to the main system. Could have been released anywhere along the line. Finch's office, the lecture halls, even the cleaning closet." He pointed to a diagram pinned to the wall, a maze of lines crisscrossing the science wing like a village's hidden paths. Miss Marple studied the diagram, her fingers brushing the edge of her handbag. A shared system, she said, almost to herself, like a village stream, carrying whatever's poured into it. She turned to Crane. And Dr. Finch's office, its duct connects directly to the laboratory, does it not? Crane nodded, flipping open his notebook. It does. Finch's office is just down the hall, and the ducts run parallel. If someone tampered with the systems, planted a canister or rigged a valve, they could have dosed the lab without setting foot inside. Finch would have known how. His research is all about gas dispersal. But we've got no smoking gun, no device, no fingerprints. He rubbed his temples, the strain of the case evident. We searched his office yesterday, nothing but papers, and a few old experiments. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained serene. Nothing, she said, is often the loudest clue, Inspector. A man like Dr. Finch, with his knowledge and his grudge, might hide his tools in plain sight. She thought of a St. Mary's baker whose innocent flour sack had concealed stolen silver. Overlooked by all but a nosy neighbor, Crane led her into the laboratory, the police tape briefly lifted to allow entry. The room was as sterile as before, its benches gleaming, its air still faintly metallic despite days of ventilation. Miss Marple moved slowly, her steps deliberate, her gaze lingering on the ventilation grate above Caldwell's desk. It was higher than the others, its slats angled to direct airflow downward, directly over where the professor had sat. A precise choice, she murmured, for a precise crime. She thought of a village poisoner who had laced a teapot's spout, ensuring the venom reached its mark. She turned to Crane, her voice gentle but probing. The residue in the ductus could it have been released remotely, perhaps with a timer or a trigger. The technician, who had followed them in, nodded. Possible. A small canister, pressurized, could have been set to release on a delay. The gas is stable enough to linger in the ducts, building up until it hit the lab's filters. Whoever did it would have needed to know the system's flow rates, how fast the air moves, where it pools. He glanced at Crane. That's advanced stuff. Not your average cleaner's expertise. Miss Marple's needles, produced from her bag, began to click softly. But a chemist's, she said, or a student's, perhaps. Dr. Finch, with his dispersal research, would understand such things. And Mr. Reed, with his work on the gas itself, might also know. She paused, her eyes drifting to the grate. And Mrs. Dobbs, with her nightly rounds, might she have noticed a change in the air, a sound in the ducts. Crane's expression sharpened. Clara's been cagey about that night. Says she smelled nothing, heard nothing. But that gas mask in the cleaning closets got us wondering. She had access, same as the others, but the know-how's the sticking point. He jotted a note, then added, Evelyn's the wild card. Her chemistry background's rusty, but she was in the lab that evening. Could have seen something, or done something. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving the suspects. Threads of Island's visit, Reed's ambition, Finch's expertise, Dobbs's access into the laboratory's sterile frame. A ventilation system, she said, is like a village whisper, carrying secrets to those who listen. She thought of a St. Mary's gossip who overheard a plot through a thin cottage wall, her ear pressed to the plaster, determined to test Finch's composure. Miss Marple persuaded Crane to accompany her to his office, a cramped room cluttered with books and chemical models. Finch was there, hunched over a stack of papers, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Miss Marple. Inspector, he said, his voice tight, and, Miss Marple, is it? What's this about? Only a few questions, Dr. Finch, Crane said, his tone neutral. We're looking at the ventilation system. Your office shares the lab's ducts, and we found gas residue. Care to explain? Finch's fingers twitched, and he pushed his papers aside. I've told you, I was in my office that evening, working. I didn't touch the ducts. My research is theoretical dispersal patterns, not murder weapons. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted a bead of sweat on his brow, like a village clerk caught fudging accounts. "Oh, Dr. Finch," she said, her voice gentle as a breeze, "your work must be fascinating. Dispersing gases through confined spaces, it's almost like sending a message, isn't it? Silent, unseen, but so effective." She tilted her head, her eyes soft but piercing. "The ducts, I imagine, would be perfect for such a demonstration." Finch's face paled further, and he stood abruptly, knocking a pen to the floor. "I don't know what you're implying," he snapped. "I had nothing to do with Henry's death. He was a thief, stealing my ideas, my grants, but I didn't kill him." His voice cracked, and he caught himself, sitting back down with a forced calm. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind filing away his outburst, like a village tailor's rant that betrayed a deeper guilt. Crane, sensing the shift, pressed further. "Your logbook entry, Finch the cylinder replacement, a week before the murder. Routine, you said, but we're checking every cylinder in the wing. If one's tainted, it'll point to someone with access and knowledge. That includes you." Finch's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his eyes fixed on his desk. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her voice soothing. "Truth, Dr. Finch, has a way of rising, like gas through a duct. It's only a matter of time." She thought of a St. Mary's farmer, whose routine delivery hid a stolen calf. "Exposed by a stray hoofprint, as they left the office," Crane muttered. "He's rattled. But he's not cracking. If he hid a device, it's not in his office or we missed it." He glanced at Miss Marple. "You've got a knack for getting under their skin. What's your read?" Her needles clicked, her voice low. "Dr. Finch, Inspector, is a man consumed by what he's lost. His knowledge is his weapon, and the ducts, I think, were his path. But proof that's the stitch we need." She thought of a St. Mary's poacher whose trap was found by tracing a single feather. They returned to the laboratory, where the technician was packing his tools. He handed Crane a small vial, its contents a faint gray powder. "Residue from the duct's filter," he said. "It's the gas, all right, and there's a trace of something else metallic, maybe from a canister. We're analyzing it now." Crane's eyes lit up, but Miss Marple's remained steady, her mind already tracing the duck's path to Finch's office. Reed's experiments, Dobbs's closet, Evelyn's briefcase. The college clock struck noon, its chimes sharp in the quiet corridor. Miss Marple stepped into the quadrangle, the air fresh with the scent of wet grass. The ventilation clue, she sensed, was the case's hinge, swinging the door of the locked room wide. Finch's expertise, his proximity, his bitterness, they wove a pattern too tight to ignore. Yet the other's Evelyn's secrets, Reed's, boasts. Dobbs's silence still tugged at her thoughts. She thought of a St. Mary's quilt, its pattern clear only when the final patch was sewn, and her steps quickened, the truth shimmering just beyond her grasp. Chapter 9. The student slipped. The midday sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary's Mead, bathing the college quadrangle in a rare warmth that did little to ease the tension of Professor Henry Caldwell's unsolved murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a bench outside the library, her knitting bag at her side, watched students hurry past with books and worried glances. Her lavender shawl was draped neatly over her shoulders, but her mind was far from the serene village. Spinster she appeared to be, the ventilation clue had sharpened her focus on the laboratory's secrets, and today she turned her attention to Thomas Reed, the ambitious student whose boasts and uneasy manner suggested a thread worth pulling. She knew that young men, like village lads, often tripped over their own bravado, and Thomas's slip, she sensed, was near. Miss Marple had learned from Raymond that Thomas was scheduled to assist in a chemistry lecture that afternoon, a chance to observe him under pressure. She made her way to the lecture hall, a modern annex to the science wing, with tiered seats and a blackboard scrawled with formulas. Slipping into a back row, she produced her knitting, a gray shawl, its stitches a rhythm for her thoughts, and settled in as students filed past. Thomas stood at the front, arranging glassware for a demonstration, his lanky frame taut with nervous energy. His gold watch glinted under the lights, a detail Miss Marple noted with the same scrutiny she once gave a St. Mary's apprentice's gifted boots. The lecturer, a jovial professor named Dr. Harrow, began with a discussion of gas properties, his voice booming through the hall. Thomas, tasked with preparing a harmless nitrogen compound, moved with practiced ease. But Miss Marple's eyes caught the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted a valve. When Dr. Harrow mentioned Caldwell's research, Thomas's head snapped up, his face flushing. Thomas was Henry's right hand, Harrow said, clapping the student's shoulder. He'll carry the torch, won't you, lad? Thomas forced a smile, but his eyes darted to the door, as if expecting pursuit. Miss Marple thought of young Billy Stokes, a St. Mary's boy whose nervous grin had betrayed a stolen pie. After the lecture, as students dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, feigning interest in a periodic table on the wall. Thomas was packing up, his movements hurried, when Inspector Crane entered, his notebook in hand. The sight of the inspector made Thomas freeze, a beaker nearly slipping from his grip. Crane, spotting Miss Marple, gave her a wry nod before approaching. "The student, read," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "A word. We've got questions about that logbook entry, the cylinder replacement you signed for Caldwell. Care to clarify?" Thomas's face paled, but he straightened, his voice striving for confidence. "I told you, Inspector," the professor asked. "Me to log it. He was busy, so I signed for him. It was just a routine swap, nothing special." His fingers twitched, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow. Like a village lad caught with a poacher's snare. Crane's eyes narrowed. "Routine, maybe, but the timing's odd. A week before the murder, and now we've got gas residue in the ducts. You worked with the formula, knew how to mix it. If that cylinder was tampered with, you'd have had the chance." He flipped a page in his notebook. "And your alibi's still thin. No one saw you in your dorm after 9:30 that night." Thomas's bravado faltered, his voice rising. "I was there. I told you. I left the lab, went to my room, and stayed in. I didn't touch any cylinder, and I didn't kill him." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple, as if seeking an ally, but her expression was one of gentle curiosity, her needles clicking softly. She thought of a St. Mary's clerk who protested his innocence too loudly, his lies unraveling over a misplaced receipt. Crane pressed further, his voice low but relentless. "That notebook of yours, read the one with the gas formula. You said it was for your thesis, but it's a perfect match for the murder weapon. Care to explain why you kept that quiet?" Thomas swallowed, his hands clenching. "It's not what you think. The professor shared the formula with MIT, was part of my work. I wasn't hiding anything. He was secretive, that's all. Didn't want the formula out before publication." His words tumbled out, and Miss Marple caught a note of fear, not of guilt, but of exposure. She thought of a village boy who forged a letter to protect a mentor. His loyalty a shield for another's crime. Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping slightly as she approached, her voice soft but deliberate. "Mr. Reed," she said, "you must have been so proud to work with Professor Caldwell. Such a responsibility, handling his formulas, his equipment. But secrets, I find, are heavy burdens for a young man. Did he ask you to keep other things? Quiet, perhaps, about that cylinder?" Her eyes, mild but piercing, held his, and Thomas flinched, as if struck. He didn't ask me to lie," Thomas stammered. "The cylinder was his idea. He said it needed replacing, told me to log it. I didn't question him, he was the professor." His voice cracked, and he looked away, his shoulders sagging. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind filing away his admission, like a village girl's confession about a borrowed ribbon. Crane, sensing a crack, leaned in. So Caldwell ordered the swap, and you just followed orders. Convenient. Reed. If that cylinder was doctored, you're either complicit or a fool. Which is it? His tone was sharp, but Miss Marple's gentle. Presence seemed to temper Thomas's panic, coaxing more than accusing. I'm no fool, Thomas said, his voice low. But I didn't know. I didn't think anything of it then. He was always tinkering, changing things. I just did what he said. His eyes met Miss Marple's pleading. I wanted to make my mark, that's all. The job offer, it's real, but it's tied to the research. I needed Caldwell alive, not dead. His words rang with a desperate sincerity, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. Crane jotted a note, his skepticism clear. We'll check the cylinder logs again, Reed, and your dorm expect another search. If you're holding back, now's the time to talk. He glanced at Miss Marple, as if acknowledging her role in loosening Thomas's tongue, then turned back to the student. Don't leave the college without telling me. As Thomas gathered his things and fled the hall, his satchel clutched tightly. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her needles resuming their rhythm. Crane approached, his voice low. You've got away with them, Miss Marple. He's scared, but I'm not sure it's of us. What's your take? She tilted her head, her eyes distant, but bright. Young Mr. Reed, Inspector, is a pawn, not a king. His ambition drives him, but his fears of being caught in another's game. That logbook entry, he signed it, but I wonder if he understood what he was signing. She thought of a St. Mary's lad who endorsed a forged check, unaware of the mastermind behind it. Crane rubbed his chin, considering. You think he's covering for someone? Caldwell, maybe, or Finch. The cylinders are best lead, but if Reed's telling the truth, someone used him to set it up. He flipped his notebook closed. We're analyzing that metallic trace from the duct residue. If it's from a canister, it might point to the source, Finch's office, the lab, or even the cleaning closet. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her voice soft, but probing. A canister, she said, is a small thing, but it carries a great weight. Thomas knows more than he says, but not as much as he fears. The ducts, I think, will lead us to the hand that placed it. She thought of a village poisoner whose vial, hidden in a hedgerow, was traced by a single drop. Meanwhile, Miss Marple reflected on the other suspects. Evelyn Caldwell's presence in the lab that evening, delivering the briefcase, placed her near the scene. But her claim of forgotten chemistry seemed genuine. Her hesitation in the chapel had lacked the cunning of a chemist. Clara Dobbs, with her master key and nightly rounds, could have seen or moved a device, but her resentment, raw as it was, felt too blunt for the gas's precision. Finch, however, with his dispersal expertise and office duct, loomed larger. His bitterness a motive as potent as the gas itself. Yet Thomas's slipped the forged logbook entries adjusted a plan larger than one man's envy. The lecture hall emptied, leaving Miss Marple and Crane in the quiet. She rose, tucking her knitting away, and glanced at the blackboard. Its formula is a cryptic map of the crime. A student, she said to Crane, almost to herself, is a mirror, reflecting his master's light or his shadow. Thomas reflects. Someone, Inspector, and that someone is close. She thought of a St. Mary's pupil whose essay, copied from a tutor's notes, revealed a deeper betrayal. Crane escorted her to the quadrangle, where the college clock struck 2, its chimes, sharp in the warm air. I'll lean on Reed again, he said, and check Finch's office for that canister. You've got me thinking, Miss Marple, too much. Maybe. He tipped his hat, a grudging smile breaking through. Miss Marple smiled back, her handbag swinging, as she walked toward the guest house. Thomas's slip had cracked a window in the case, letting in light on the laboratory's secrets. The ducts, the cylinder, the forged entry, they were stitches in a pattern, And Finch, she sensed, was the needle's point. Yet the other's Evelyn's secrets. Clara's silence still tugged at her thoughts. Like a village mystery, where every clue pointed to a different heart. She thought of a St. Mary's riddle, solved by a child's skipped stone, and her steps were light, the truth a breath away. Chapter 10. The colleague's gambit. The late afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary's Mead, casting long shadows across the college quadrangle as Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlor of the Red Lion guest house, her knitting needles clicking with a steady rhythm. The case of Professor Henry Caldwell's murder had reached a delicate juncture. The ventilation ducts and Thomas Reed's slip pointing ever more sharply toward Dr. Marcus Finch, the embittered colleague whose expertise and proximity made him a shadow too dark to ignore. Miss Marple, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, had resolved to test Finch's nerve, sensing that his bitterness, like a village grudge, might betray him under pressure. She had invited him to tea at the guest house, a setting as disarming as a St. Mary's vicarage, where secrets often spilled over scones. The parlor was a cozy haven, its chintz curtains softening the light, and a fire crackling in the grate. Miss Marple had arranged a small table with a teapot, cups, and a plate of shortbread, her knitting bag at her side like a trusted confidant. Raymond, her nephew, had protested the meeting, calling it meddling with a suspect. But Miss Marple's gentle insistence had prevailed. "My dear Raymond," she had said, "a cup of tea is merely a conversation. And conversations, like village gossip, reveal more than they intend." She thought of Mrs. Price, a St. Mary's busybody whose tea chats had unraveled a theft. Finch arrived promptly at 4, his gray suit as dour as his expression. He was a lean man, his thinning hair combed flat, his eyes wary as he took the offered chair. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped, "I'm not sure why you've asked me here. I've told the police everything I know about Henry's death." His fingers drummed on the armrest, a faint tremor betraying his unease, like a village clerk caught with a doctored ledger. "Oh, Dr. Finch," Miss Marple replied, pouring tea. With a steady hand, "I'm only an old woman with a curiosity about science. Your work dispersing gases, I believe, sounds so fascinating. I thought you might indulge me with a little explanation." Her tone was warm, her eyes mild, but they held Finch's gaze with a quiet intensity, honed over decades of village observations. Finch accepted the cup, his movements stiff. "It's technical," he said, stirring his tea unnecessarily. "I study how gases move through confined spaces, ventilation systems, for instance. It's theoretical, not the sort of thing that wins grants like Henry's flashy projects." His voice carried a familiar bitterness, and Miss Marple noted the way his jaw tightened at Caldwell's name, like a St. Mary's farmer cursing a rival's bumper crop. "How modest," she said, offering the shortbread. "But surely your knowledge was vital to the college. The laboratory's ventilation system, for example, it must rely on men like you to keep it safe." She tilted her head, her needles pausing as she added, "Such a system could be manipulated, I suppose, by someone who understood its ways." Finch's hand froze mid-stir, his eyes narrowing. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I had nothing to do with Henry's death. The police have searched my office, questioned me. I was working that night, nowhere near the lab after 8. His voice was sharp, but Miss Marple caught a tremor, like a village boy denying a prank that left a gate unlatched. "Of course," she said, her smile unwavering. "But you and Professor Caldwell were rivals, were you not? I've heard whispers forgive an old woman's ear for gossip that he took credit for your ideas, perhaps even a grant. It must have been galling, seeing him shine while you labored in the shade." Her words were gentle, but they struck like a needle through fabric, and Finch's face flushed, his cup clattering against its saucer. "He was a thief," Finch snapped, then caught himself, his voice dropping. "I mean, Henry had a knack for claiming what wasn't his. Years ago, an idea of Mina, dispersal model ended up in his paper. No credit to me. The grant last year, too, he charmed the committee, took the funding I'd worked for, but I didn't kill him. I'm not that sort. His eyes darted to the fire, avoiding hers, and Miss Marple thought of Mr. Cole, a St. Mary's grocer, whose forgiven grudge led to a tampered scale. How unfair, Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. Envy is a heavy burden, Dr. Finch. It can make a man see chances where others see walls, like a ventilation duct. Perhaps, carrying a silent message. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but piercing. The police found residue in those ducts, you know. A gas, precise and deadly, released from somewhere close. Your office, I believe, is very close indeed. Finch's face drained of color, his fingers gripping the armrest. That's nonsense, he said, but his voice cracked, and he stood abruptly, nearly upsetting the table. I won't be accused by some meddling spinster. The ducks are shared. Anyone could have tampered with them. Reed, Dobbs, even Evelyn. Why aren't you hounding them? His outburst was raw, his composure unraveling, and Miss Marple's needles remained still, her eyes never leaving his face. Sit, Dr. Finch, she said, her voice calm but firm, like a village matron soothing a tantrum. I'm not accusing, only wondering. Truth, you see, is like a gas. It rises, no matter how one tries to contain it. She thought of a St. Mary's chemist whose accidental spill was traced to a rival's sabotage. His panic the final clue. Finch sank back into the chair, his breathing uneven. I didn't do it, he muttered, but the fight had gone out of him, his shoulders slumping. Miss Marple poured more tea, her movements deliberate, giving him space to stew. She sensed a man teetering, his bitterness a weight he could no longer carry alone. But before she could press further, a knock at the door announced Inspector Crane, his face grim with purpose. Miss Marple, Crane said, stepping inside. Sorry to interrupt, but we've got something. He glanced at Finch, his eyes narrowing. Dr. Finch, you'll want to hear this. We searched your office again, found a hidden vial in a locked drawer. Precursor to the gas, matches the residue in the ducts. Care to explain? Finch's mouth opened, then closed, his face ashen. That's for my research, he stammered. Standard compounds, nothing illegal. You can't pin this on me. His voice rose, but it lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow. Like a village thief caught with a stolen watch, Crane's expression was unyielding. We're testing it now. If it's the precursor, it ties you to the murder weapon, and those ductizor technician found a modified valve in the line to your office. Someone rigged it to release a canister remotely. You wrote the book on dispersal. Finch, looks bad. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, then stilled, her mind weaving the vial, the valve, and Finch's panic into a pattern nearly complete. A valve, she said softly, is such a small thing, Dr. Finch, but it directs so much, like a grudge, held too long, directing a man to act. She thought of a St. Mary's gardener, whose adjusted irrigation pipe flooded a rival's. Plot, his motive clear in his trembling hands. Finch stood again, his voice hoarse. I'm not saying another word without a lawyer. You've got nothing but guesses. He pushed past Crane, his steps unsteady, and left the parlor, the door slamming behind him. Crane watched him go, then turned to Miss Marple, his notebook. Already open. You rattled him, he said, a grudging admiration in his tone. That vial's a breakthrough, and the valve seals it. We're tracing the canister, now might be in the ducts, or disposed of. Finch is our man, isn't he? Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes distant but bright. He is a man, Inspector, with the means and the motive. His knowledge, his office, his envy, they fit the crime, like a glove. But gloves, you know, can be worn by others. She thought of a St. Mary's seamstress who lent her scissors to a thief, her innocence a thin veil. Thomas's forged logbook, Evelyn's briefcase, Clara's key, they still tug at the edges. Finch's gambit was bold, but was it his alone? Crane jotted a note, his brow furrowed. You're saying he had help? Reed, maybe, covering his tracks, or Evelyn, setting the stage. Clara's too blunt for this, I reckon. He paused, eyeing her. You've got a theory, don't you? Miss Marple smiled, setting her cup down. Only that human nature, Inspector, is a tangled skein. Finch's bitterness drove him, but the laboratory's silence hides more than one heart. The ducts, the vial, the valve their stitches, but the pattern needs one more thread. She thought of a St. Mary's quilt, its final patch revealing a hidden name. The college clock struck 5, its chimes muffled by the parlor's thick walls. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her mind racing through Finch's outburst. The vial's discovery, the valve's precision. The case was closing, the locked room no longer a fortress, but a trap, sprung by its own maker. Yet the others, Evelyn's secrets, Thomas's fear, Clara's silence lingered like echoes. And Miss Marple knew the truth, like her shawl, required every stitch to be complete. She thought of a St. Mary's riddle, solved by a single word overheard at a market, and rose, ready for the final act. Chapter 11. The Confession. The evening shadows lengthened over St. Mary's Mead. The college quadrangle hushed under a sky bruised with clouds. Miss Jane Marple sat in the Red Lion Guesthouse's parlor, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her lavender shawl draped over the arm of her chair. The discovery of the vial and modified valve in Dr. Marcus Finch's office had tightened the noose around the embittered chemist, and Inspector Crane had summoned the suspects Evelyn Caldwell, Thomas Reed, Clara Dobbs, and Finch himself to the science wing for a final confrontation. Miss Marple, invited as an observer at Crane's grudging insistence, felt the case nearing its close, like a village mystery solved by the last turn of a key. She knew that confessions, like St. Mary's church bells, rang clearest under pressure. The science wing's lecture hall, where the confrontation was to take place, was a stark, modern room with tiered seats and a long table at the front, where Crane had arranged chairs for the suspects. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, taking a seat, at the back, her black handbag at her side. The air was heavy with tension, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the faces of those gathered. Evelyn, in widow's black, sat with her hands clasped, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her eyes wary but composed. Thomas, his lanky frame hunched, fidgeted with his watch, his bravado replaced by a pallor of fear. Clara, her wiry arms crossed, stared at the floor, her lips a thin line of defiance. Finch, his gray suit rumpled, sat rigid, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. Crane stood at the table's head, his notebook open, flanked by 2 constables. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but commanding. We're here to settle Professor Caldwell's murder, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. The evidence points to a plant lever, precise and cold. Gas, released through the lab's ventilation ducts, killed him in a locked room. We've got the how, now we need the who. He paused, letting the words sink in, and Miss Marple, eyes sharp behind her spectacles, noted each suspect's reaction. Evelyn's slight flinch, Thomas's swallow, Clara's stillness, Finch's clenched jaw. Crane turned to Finch, his tone sharpening. Dr. Finch, let's start with you. We found a vial of the gas's precursor in your office, hidden in a locked drawer. A modified valve in the duct line to your office, rigged to release a canister remotely. You're a dispersal expert, with a grudge against Caldwell for stealing your ideas and grants. The logbook shows you replaced a cylinder a week before the murder. Care to explain? Finch's face flushed, his voice rising. I've told you, the vial was for my research standard compounds. The valve, I don't know anything about it. Anyone could have planted it. Reed Dobbs, even her. He jabbed a finger at Evelyn, who gasped, her handkerchief rising too, her lips Miss Marple noted the desperation in his tone, like a St. Mary's poacher blaming a neighbor for his traps. Crane didn't flinch. The cylinder log, Finch. Thomas says Caldwell ordered it, but you signed it, and Reed's signature. Looks forged you're doing, maybe, to cover your tracks. He glanced at Thomas, who shrank in his chair, his eyes wide. I didn't forge anything, Thomas blurted, his voice cracking. The professor told me to log it, I swear. I didn't know what it was for. His hands trembled, and Miss Marple thought of a village lad, caught in a lie. His panic betraying a larger scheme. Crane turned to Evelyn, his voice softening but firm. Mrs. Caldwell, you were in the lab that evening, delivering a briefcase. You studied chemistry once enough to know the gas's properties. And your marriage was strained, wasn't it? Money troubles, maybe a fondness for Dean Whitmore. Did you see a chance to be free? Evelyn's eyes flashed, her composure cracking. How dare you? Yes, I brought the briefcase, but I left after 10 minutes. Henry and I had our troubles, but I loved him. I couldn't mix that gas. I barely remember my college chemistry. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were dry, and Miss Marple noted the truth in her indignation, like a St. Mary's widow whose grief was real but incomplete. Finally, Crane faced Clara, his tone measured. Mrs. Dobbs, you had a master key, access to the lab every night, a gas mask in your closet, and a grudge against Caldwell for not helping your son. You cleaned that night, saw something, maybe did something. Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes meeting Crane's with a fierce glint. I cleaned, I left, didn't touch no mask, didn't mix no gas. Caldwell was a cold man, but I'm no killer. My Jimmy's in jail, but I don't settle scores with poison. Her voice was raw, her hands steady, and Miss Marple saw the honesty of a village woman wronged but unbroken. Miss Marple, silent until now, rose, her shawl slipping slightly as she stepped forward, her voice gentle but carrying. Inspector, if I may. Crane nodded, his expression a mix of curiosity and resignation. She turned to Finch, her eyes soft but unyielding. Dr. Finch, you spoke of Professor Caldwell's theft, your ideas, your grants. It must have burned, seeing him succeed while you faded. The ducts, so close to your office, were a path no one else would think to use. A valve, a canister, a moment's work for a man who knew how gases dance. She paused, her needles glinting in her hand. But envy, you see, is a loud master. It speaks when you wish it silent. Finch's face crumpled, his hands gripping the table. You don't understand, he whispered, then louder. I couldn't stand it anymore. Henry took everything, my work, my future. I rigged the valve, used the precursor from my research. The cylinder was a decoy. Thomas logged it, thinking it was routine. I released the gas through the ducts, just enough to stop him. His voice broke, and he slumped, tears streaking his face. I only wanted my work back, my name. The room fell silent, the confession a thunderclap. Evelyn gasped, covering her mouth. Thomas stared, his fear giving way to shock. Clara's eyes softened, as if pitying a broken man. Crane signaled the constables, who moved to Finch's side, their faces grim. Marcus Finch, Crane said, you're under arrest for the murder of Henry Caldwell. Anything you say. I've said it, Finch spat, his voice hollow. He didn't deserve the credit. I did. He let the constables lead him out, his steps heavy, his fight gone. Miss Marple watched, her expression serene but tinged with sadness, like a St. Mary's vicar witnessing a sinner's fall. Crane turned to the others, his voice brisk. You're free to go, but we'll need statements. Reed, we'll talk about that logbook. Mrs. Caldwell, Mrs. Dobbs, thank you for your cooperation. Evelyn rose, her face pale, and left without a word, her handkerchief clutched tightly. Thomas followed, his head bowed, his ambition dimmed. Clara lingered, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's briefly. a nod of acknowledgment passing between them, like village women sharing a silent truth. As the hall emptied, Crane approached Miss Marple, his notebook closed. "You did it again," he said, a grudging smile breaking through. "That tea with Finch, you knew he'd crack under pressure." "How'd you see it?" Miss Marple tucked her needles away, her voice soft. "Human nature, Inspector, is never locked. Dr. Finch's envy was a fire, burning too bright to hide. The ducts, the vial, the valves, they were his tools, but his heart was his betrayer." She thought of a St. Mary's blacksmith, whose rage at a rival's forge led to a hammer's slip, his guilt clear in his trembling hands. Crane shook his head, marveling. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple. We'll tie up the loose-end slab reports, duct analysis, but Finch's confession seals it. He thought the locked room would fool us." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes distant. "A locked room, Inspector, is only a challenge, not a shield. People, you see, leave traces in their pride and their pain." She thought of a St. Mary's attic, its sealed door undone by a child's curiosity, and gathered her shawl, the case resolved but its echoes lingering. The college clock struck 7, its chimes swallowed by the evening mist. Miss Marple stepped into the quadrangle, the air cool against her face. Finch's gambit had failed, his envy the gas that choked him. Evelyn would mourn, perhaps with relief. Thomas would learn, or falter. Clara would scrub on, her heart unburdened. The laboratory, silent now, held no more secrets, and Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of a knot untied, a truth laid bare. Chapter 12. The quiet return. The mist had lifted from St. Mary's Mead by the morning of Miss Jane Marple's departure, leaving the college spires sharp against a pale November sky. She sat by the window of her room at the Red Lion guest house, her knitting packed neatly in her black handbag, her lavender shawl folded over the chair. The case of Professor Henry Caldwell's murder was resolved. Dr. Marcus Finch's confession, a stark unraveling of envy that had silenced the laboratory's secrets. Yet Miss Marple, as she sipped her final cup of Earl Grey, felt the familiar weight of human frailty, like a village tragedy that lingered in the heart long after the truth was known. Her nephew, Raymond West, joined her for breakfast, his face a mix of relief and bemusement. "Aunt Jane," he said, spreading marmalade on his toast, "you've done it again. The college is buzzing. Finch arrested, the lab cleared, and you at the center of it all. I thought you were here to talk about lace." His tone was teasing, but his eyes held a grudging admiration, like a St. Mary's lad conceding a game to a sharper player. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "My dear Raymond, lace and murder are not so different. Both are patterns, woven from threads of care and carelessness. Dr. Finch wove his too tightly, and it unraveled." She thought of a St. Mary's quilt, its stitches hiding a lover's cipher, revealed by a spinster's patient eye. Raymond leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But how did you know it was Finch?" Evelyn had her secrets, Thomas his ambition, Clara her grudge. Any of them could have done it, with that lab and its ducks. Miss Marple set down her cup, her voice soft but clear. "People, Raymond, betray themselves in their silences and their noise." Evelyn's grief was strained, but her heart was elsewhere. Dean Whitmore, not murder. Thomas's boasts were loud, but his fear was of exposure, not guilt. He was a pawn, signing a logbook he didn't understand. Clara's anger was real, but blunt. She lacked the cunning for such a precise crime. Finch, though his bitterness was a fire fed by years of slights. His knowledge of the ducts, his vial, his valve, they were the tools of a man who saw no other way. She paused, her eyes distant. "Science, you see, is no match for spite." She thought of Mr. Harrow, a St. Mary's gardener, whose envy of a rival's roses led to a poisoned root, his motive clear in his furtive glances. Finch's envy, she sensed, had been as potent. His laboratory, a garden where resentment bloomed, Raymond shook his head, marveling. And the locked room. That baffled Crane. How did you see through it? Miss Marple's fingers brushed her handbag, as if tracing an invisible stitch. A locked room, Raymond, is only a story we tell ourselves. The laboratory was no fortress, its ducts were a path, silent and open to a clever mind. Finch used them as a village poacher uses a hedgerow, unseen but deadly. The valve, the canister, the precursor, they were his snare, set with the precision of his pain. She thought of a St. Mary's attic, its sealed door undone by a hidden latch, found by a child's marble. As they finished breakfast, Inspector Crane arrived. His coat brushed clean, but his eyes still heavy with the case's toll. He tipped his hat to Miss Marple, a rare smile breaking through. Miss Marple, you're leaving us, I hear. St. Mary's mead won't be the same without you stirring the pot. Finch is in custody, full confession filed. The lab's being scrubbed for classes, and the college wants this buried fast. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but graceful. Truth, Inspector, is never truly buried. Dr. Finch's confession clears the air, but the college will carry its scars. Evelyn's regret, Thomas's lesson, Clara's quiet strength. She thought of a St. Mary's widow whose husband's crime left a village whispering, her resilience a silent hymn. Crane nodded, tucking his notebook away. We found the canister, by the way, hidden in a duct junction near Finch's office. Tiny thing, pressurized, with a timer. He'd planned it for weeks, used Reed to log the cylinder as a distraction. Evelyn and Dobbs were just noise. Place, wrong time. He paused, eyeing her. You saw it all, didn't you? Before we did? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her voice was humble. I only see what people show, Inspector. Their hearts, their hesitations, they're the map of any crime. Finch's map was drawn in envy, and the ducks were his road. She thought of a St. Mary's path, where a thief's footprint led to a stolen hen. The mark clear to a watchful eye. Raymond, gathering her bags, interjected. Come on, Aunt Jane. You'll miss your train if we don't hurry. Let Crane handle the paperwork. He grinned at the inspector, who shook Miss Marple's hand with a warmth that belied his gruff demeanor. Safe travels, Miss Marple, Crane said. And if you're ever back, give me warning. I'll need a holiday first. She laughed softly, her handbag swinging as they left the guest house. The station was a short walk, the air crisp with autumn's end. As they passed the college, Miss Marple glanced at the science wing, its windows glinting like eyes now free of secrets. Evelyn, she imagined, would find solace, perhaps with Whitmore. Thomas would study, chastened but wiser. Clara would scrub, her son's name a quiet spur. Finch, in his cell, would face the cost of his gambit, his laboratory a memory of failure at the platform. Raymond hugged her, his voice fond. You're impossible, Aunt Jane. St. Mary's will talk of this for years, the spinster who cracked the locked room. Miss Marple patted his cheek, her smile serene. Let them talk, Raymond. Stories, like lace, need a few knots to hold. She boarded the train, settling by the window, her handbag on her lap. As the countryside rolled past, she thought of her cottage in St. Mary's Mead. Its fire waiting, its roses dormant, but alive. The case was done, another pattern woven, another truth freed from its tangle. She thought of a St. Mary's riddle, solved by a single petal caught in a gate, and closed her eyes. The train's rhythm a lullaby for a mind that never quite rested. The gassed professor was at peace, his killer unmasked, and Miss Marple, as always, returned to her village, where new threads awaited her nimble hands.